Y'all, there is something in the air lately, and I am hearing from more and more first-time memoir authors that they sat down to write their memoir and it just poured out of them. And while this may seem like a dream to so many of you out there, I know if you're experiencing this, it actually is oddly bewildering. And that's why today I want to talk about what should you do next if your memoir pours out of you. Stay tuned. Most memoirs don't stall because of lack of time. Most memoirs stall because of lack of clarity. And that's why I put together the Memoir Method Checklist. The idea here is to give you every single step in the process, not because that makes it easy, of course not, but because no project is ever completed until you know what the steps in the process actually are. You can download it free at pageandpodium.com/checklist. If y'all are like me, for the past at least 2 or 3 months, you have been looking around and wondering where all of the intensity is coming from. There is just something that has been in the air since maybe March or April, where it feels like folks are being a lot bolder, taking a lot bolder steps forward, claiming what they want and going for it. And folks, I am so here for this. This is such an energy that is so close to my heart that I love so much. But it really brought to the forefront something that we have not talked about on this channel before, but that I have really started to see a lot in the consults that I do with authors who are working on their book, wanting to see if there's a little more support that they could get, or even pitching their book to Page and Podium Press as a member of our list. So I wanted to dig into this issue because I think it's kind of a surprising issue. And the way this really kind of crystallized in my mind as something that I wanted to talk with you all about today is that I had a consult with an author whose book sounded so good, but it was a really early idea. So oftentimes in these calls, if you book a call with me and you've got an early idea like that, we'll spend a lot of the call just kind of talking about market viability, whether this is the kind of thing that's going to resonate, and how we can make it resonate even more, how we can really set you up to write the best book that you can write. So that's what I did with this author, and she went off into the world, excited, ready, was going to get in touch with me when she needed support. Well, y'all, it was not even 2 weeks later that I heard from her, and she had written her entire memoir. This blew me away, seriously, knocked me off my feet. But since then, I have seen this happen at least 2 other times. And the way that this is described, the way that this woman, the way that the others have described it to me, is I just sat down and my memoir just poured out of me. Now, it is tough to complain about that, and I certainly do not want to imply that any of these women I've talked to were complaining. But at the same time, there is something that needs to be acknowledged in this win, this victory that so many people would be so jealous of. And that is that when your memoir pours out of you, it's not done. And if your memoir pours out of you in this sort of not fully formed state, well, now you've got to deal with kind of a mass of clay that it's now your job to shape. Now, this is not the end of the world. Certainly many, many authors over history have written in this way. A very, very fast draft that's then shaped and molded into something amazing. So do not take from me that this is not a good place to start. Rather, what I want to acknowledge is that when we set out to write a memoir, oftentimes we don't have a really clear sense of all of the things it's going to demand of us. Oftentimes, when we come into this process, we really assume that the hardest thing, the biggest challenge that we will face is just getting enough words on the page. And this makes total sense because I have learned over the years that when I tell an author that we're aiming for 60,000 words, oftentimes eyes just glaze over. It is really, really hard to think in a word count. And once we start breaking that down, 60,000 words, 200 double-spaced pages, 20 chapters, 10 pages each, it starts to feel as though the main challenge of writing a memoir will just simply be coming up with 60,000 words and typing them into your computer. That is a challenge, but there are multiple other challenges that really need to be acknowledged. And before we get into the practical steps that I want you to take if you're in this position, I really want you to hear me talk about some of these other skills. Because I do find that sometimes when folks have their memoir pour out of them, it can feel, there's a little bit of shame. It can feel a little bit like shame that kind of underlies, because if you thought the only challenge you would have is words on the page, and now words are on the page, but the book doesn't read the way you want it to, well, of course, that's disappointing. That is a let down, and I do not want you to beat yourself up about that. So what are the other skills that you've really got to keep your eye open for and be really gentle with yourself for not having or having mastered yet? Well, the first one I talk about all the time, and that's structure. So y'all know this. There are many, many videos on this channel on our blog, pageandpodium.com/blog, where you can read about structure. Here we're talking about mapping the narrative. So we're talking about making sure that we're getting our reader in, that we're hitting pinch points at the proper times, that we're building to our climax, that we're resolving in a really satisfying way. And of course, in the types of memoirs that we work with at Page and Podium Press, we also want to make sure that you're hitting all of those narrative notes while also incorporating the message. Typically, the message for our folks is just as important as the story, and that is part of your structural development progress too. So that is most definitely a skill, and it is not easy at all. As you go through the process, you also are going to have to master the skill of framing and shaping the story so that it communicates the way you want it to. Now, this can be everything from communicating the emotion that you want to communicate to communicating that emotion at the level of intensity that you want to communicate, but also to choosing which pieces show up in your story so that the framework is very, very clear to your reader, what your intention, what your kind of lean, what your bias is here. Those things are all really, really important. And this sort of framework, this framing skill is not easy. This is one of the ones, by the way, that's really going to come through the weekly writing practice. And for that reason, when your memoir pours out of you, this is going to be a skill that you will really need to lean into. But the third skill that I wanted to really just highlight up front before we get into the practical tips is that a memoir is something that is going to push you so much personally. And one of the skills that I see overlooked in almost every piece of advice I see out there is that you will have to develop the capacity to sit with the emotional intensity of those individual scenes for long enough for them to develop. And this, of course, is something that you will not experience when you have that memoir pouring out of you experience. When we have to sit with an individual scene, as opposed to getting a very fast draft down, both of those things are good. But sitting with the scene, sitting with the discomfort of not being sure, for example, how to explain something that happened to you in a way that really shows how you felt. When you have to, for instance, go through a scene where you know people might think that you are to blame, but it's really important to you that people are reading your story fairly. That is emotional resonance. That is not an easy thing to sit in, and it can be quite uncomfortable. So as you go through a memoir, as you're working either through chapter by chapter at a slower pace, or as we're going to get to in a second, your revision process through that initial draft, you will be asked by this project itself to sit in the weight of that, to expand the amount that you can hold, to expand the amount of discomfort you can stand, that you can handle, as you develop out what those scenes mean, what they mean to you, how you want to frame them, where they fall in the structure, how your message connects, and so on and so forth. I heard somebody recently say that entering into business ownership was the most intense personal development journey that you can go on. And y'all, I agree as someone who owns a business. But let me say that at least a close second is a memoir writing project. When you get into this project of really digging into who you are and why you are that person, just what a memoir is, right? You are really going into depths of your own self that most people never do. And I know this sounds a little woo, But I promise, as someone who has written my own memoir, as someone who has worked with dozens of memoir authors, this process is going to push you to know yourself in a way that you would not otherwise. And I think, actually, that is one of the selling features for writing a memoir. You will come out on the other side of the process looking and feeling and knowing yourself in such a different way than you did before. Okay, so I just wanted to get that out of the way because it is a sort of oddly bewildering feeling to have a full draft in front of you and still feel kind of incomplete. And I just want y'all to know that is not a false feeling. That is not self-doubt necessarily creeping in. It really may just be an awareness that there are skills that you have not developed yet, even though you did meet that big number one challenge of getting all those words on the page. So with that said, I've got 4 steps that I want you to think about as you are moving from this poured out draft, or by the way, even if your draft was more slowly assembled, these are still steps that you can take to move forward. So the first step will not surprise any of you, and I know it is a little bit eye-roll worthy, but I still gotta say it. You got a full draft on paper, friends. You've gotta celebrate that. So if you have not done something to treat yourself at this point that your memoir is done, you've got a first draft finished, I want you right now, run, don't walk, to make a concrete plan to do something that is nourishing and exciting to you. Now, for some folks, this is going to be going out to a nice dinner, going out on some kind of a nice date, maybe with your family. But for other people, this may be something much, much quieter. Maybe you honor and celebrate yourself with a long walk in the park. Maybe you are somebody who likes to kind of sit and binge with your favorite TV show, maybe an old movie that you've always loved. There are so many ways to celebrate. But truly, I don't think I can say it enough. If you are not celebrating along the process of writing your book, you will not finish. I have seen too many people try to beat themselves up through the process. And it is that celebration, that allowing yourself to feel really good about what you've done, that is truly going to move you forward. It's going to give you that momentum to do the next step. Because number 1.5 is, even though I want you to celebrate, and I want you to celebrate full-throated, I also want you to remind yourself very gently and very kindly that having a first draft is both an accomplishment and a first step. So, remember what I said earlier? Oftentimes we will tell ourselves that the words on the page is the biggest challenge. Well, at this point, even as we're celebrating, we really need to reframe our mindset and remember that we did get the words on the page. That is worth celebrating, but not as a final step. Sometimes our brains will mislead us on that, so we've just got to gently remind ourselves as we're celebrating that we are moving forward in a big way, but we are not quite done. Okay, so the second step, once you have had your celebration, once you have loved on yourself for this amazing thing you've done, the second step is we've got to get in there and see what you've even got. Especially for memoir that pours out of you like this, oftentimes I find folks won't even really remember everything that's in there. Now, that makes perfect sense. Most of us cannot hold any whole book in our mind, let alone one that's not finished being written yet. But we still got to get in here and just take an inventory. So there's a couple of different ways that you can do this, and a lot of it, quite frankly, depends on how much you feel like you want a break. Now, the first way that you can kind of get in here, get an inventory, analyze what you're working with, is that you can get some support. Now, this is one of my favorite offers at Page and Podium Press. We offer a service called a manuscript review. Now, this is not exactly a developmental edit because a developmental edit typically is going to serve you a little better, a little bit further down the line. A manuscript review, we are literally giving you that 10,000-foot view of your book that you might have had you sat down and kind of done that outline, done more of the planning, kind of worked through a little bit more slowly. Well, oftentimes I find people are just really tired at this point, so you can hand off your manuscript and we will review it. Now, in this service, what we're doing is breaking down what's coming through strong, what's really shining. We'll also talk, though, about where your deal breakers are. Now, this is very often going to be at least one of those issues that I mentioned earlier. Either it will be an issue of structure, almost certainly, by the way, that's very, very common, or it will be an issue of emotional resonance and framing where we're not quite clear and cohesive on how your message fits with your story. Or it may be that we really need you to dig in and expand that capacity so that you can give us a little bit more humanity, a little bit more depth. So in a manuscript review, we are giving you very, very clear instructions, insert tab A into slot B, for how to make that work. But you do have another option. So if you would like to have someone else do that hard work for you, you have got the manuscript review option. Now, the second option that you have is the DIY option. And this is also great, but it will require you to sit with that manuscript a bit. So you may need to take a little break before you get here. Now, there is one process that we consistently recommend across the board for getting to this inventory stage, to effectively doing your own manuscript review, mapping out your own manuscript. And that process is called the reverse outline. Now, let me give you a pretty clear definition of what this is, because I do find that there is a little bit of confusion. When you think of a regular outline, what we are doing is writing out our outline and then using the outline to create a draft. With a reverse outline, we're reversing the process. So rather than going from an outline to a manuscript draft, we're going from the manuscript draft to an outline. What this looks like in practical terms is that you will sit down with your manuscript and you will move paragraph by paragraph, analyzing out what is happening in each point. Now, as you sit down to do this process of looking at what is in this paragraph, writing a note of what it is, this paragraph, writing a note of what it is, you will probably find that you don't need to do this for every single paragraph. Typically, we're going to have blocks of, say, 3 or 4 paragraphs. Okay, that is the wedding scene. We've got blocks maybe of a couple pages even in some cases, if it's a big scene. As we move through, you are welcome, in fact, encouraged to really condense, not by paragraph, but rather by just what's happening. Is it a scene? Is it a piece of philosophy? Is it instruction, advice? What is happening? The point is, we have got to get into that draft and really figure out what even is there. When it's a whole draft, when you've just got 200 pages, you're not going to be able to say what's in there. But once you make your reverse outline, you have a much more condensed version of what's actually on those pages. That's going to give you a way clearer sense of how you're kind of feeling about, is the structure there? Is the emotional framework there? Is this reading the way that I want to? Now, unfortunately, when we get to the end of this reverse outline process, there really are no super obvious clear answers. You still, as a DIYer, will need to look at that reverse outline and then choose what to do next. But let me strongly recommend to you that you move first through structure, as I mentioned earlier. Second, through your framing. How is your message getting in there? How is your emotional resonance getting in there? Is this reading and communicating the way that you hope it will? And then finally, make yourself sit and read the whole manuscript to build that emotional resonance, to really feel the places that you are not fully on the page, that you are holding things back, sometimes from the reader, sometimes from yourself too. So as we move through that reverse outline, you should be getting a little bit of a glimpse of places that you are a little bit weaker, that you want to ramp things up, that you want to dial things in. But then in the actual process of going back through for your revisions, you will need to use some judgment. So you've got a couple of options there as you're strategizing, as you're figuring out what you've got to work with and how you want to work with it. Either support or a DIY, or a lot of people choose to do a combination of both, and that is great too. Okay, the third thing that I want you to do after you have gone through and strategized is I want you to identify what type of draft you have. Now, I will link this in the show notes, and if you're reading on the blog, of course, you can bop over to the other blog post. But the thing that I want to point you to is that several months ago, we did an episode on the types of drafts. Now, in this episode, I break down the different types of drafts as though they were types of houses, because this is often the best parallel. We are all going for the sturdily built craftsman, is that just me? Strong, sturdy home that is going to serve us well, that is tidy. Everything has its place. All of us want that. Most drafts will start out, though, as a house that's not even really standing all that well on its own. So I'd like you to bot back to that piece of content, go through, figure out what type of draft you have. And I've got some more instructions then in that video, in that blog post, where you can read a little bit more about what to do from here. Having that reverse outline in place is going to always be the first step anyway. So you will need to make sure you've got that strategy, that inventory piece done. Then you can start thinking about what type of draft, and that episode will really funnel you into the next steps that are really appropriate for you in that case. And then finally, step 4, the last thing I want you to do is I want you to make a plan. Now, particularly for those of you where your memoir poured out the way that it did, this is going to be a newer skill for you to sit down and say, how do I want to map this process out for myself? But it is so, so important that you take the time to do this, to really plan out how do you want to move forward? What is your next step? And what are the smaller pieces within that next step? Now, this is something that we help you with if you decide to go forward with a manuscript review, if you join any of our coaching programs. We are happy to help with this planning stage because it truly is so, so important to your memoir's both process and to having an excellent product. But I also just want to remind you that as you're moving through, this planning stage is so, so important to slow you down. And remember what I said earlier, when we are thinking about building this emotional capacity, there just isn't any kind of shortcut to it. It is something that we have to work through. So if your draft went really quickly, please give yourself the time because it will be so very worth it, I promise, to have that emotional growth, to stretch yourself in what you can sit with, what you can really analyze in an in-depth way, and really how you can frame, how you can view your experience of the past in different ways, depending on what's going to serve you in this moment and in this book. Okay, if you are one of these lucky few who has had your memoir pour out of you, I truly want you to hear me say this. That is amazing. There is no way that that happened without some kind of guidance from whatever power you believe in above. Something drives us forward to be able to make these big creative marks in the sand. But the thing I want you to remember is that is only the first step. And all of us are rooting for you on the long haul of really finishing that book, making sure it's excellent. And I truly hope that also making sure that the process feels really good. Reach out to us if we can help. If you are somebody who has one of these drafts and you're feeling really, really bewildered, I can tell you that manuscript review service helps so many people. We are really proud to offer it, and I have found that it is much, much more helpful for first-time authors than when we used to do developmental edits. So come and see me. I'll talk to you a little bit more about the process, and we will get you signed up. You can visit pageandpodium.com/contact. And until then, happy writing. Most memoirs don't fail for lack of time. They fail for lack of clarity, because their author is trying to move forward in a process that is unfamiliar and unclear with no one to support their efforts. And that's why I put together something very practical, the Memoir Method Checklist. This is designed to give you every single step in the process so you not only know what you need to work on now, you know what's coming next, and after that, until you have that beautiful published book in your hands. You can download it now at pageandpodium.com/checklist.